Hi everyone, happy Thursday. My name is Katya Stepanov. If you are just tuning in for the first time, I am a co-founder of the Inheritance Project, and today I am going live with Ariel Figueroa. He is also a co-founder of the Inheritance Project. Ariel and I actually met on a dance floor. This is how I usually meet some of the best friends and people and collaborators that I have in my lifetime, is on variety of dance floors, really understanding who people are when they are fully expressed. So if you are new to the Inheritance Project, we are an educational platform and consultancy. We guide individual and collective inquiry into our inheritance, which is the ancestry stories, behaviors, beliefs, perspectives, and traits that we inherit from past generations. And we look into our inheritance so that we can consciously create our future. So I'll be diving in with Ariel today about his inheritance. Yay, here he is. And we'll get to know a little bit more about why he was drawn to this work, why he joined the team, and what inheritance means to him. Hopefully he'll be here shortly. Yay! You made it.
Hi there. Yes.
Instagram live journeys. I'm always on lives with people who've never done a live before, and it can be a little disorienting. So I'm glad that you made it into this platform that we're in together.
I know. I feel like, a little like an old man trying to figure out a computer for the first time.
Well, welcome. Welcome to Inheritance Live. I'm so glad to have you here with me today because, of course, you and I have had many conversations. This is the bread and butter, the essence of what we're doing at Inheritance Project. But I think it's a really great opportunity for everyone else to get to know you, Ariel, and what makes you you. So right
Hmm.
off the bat, I really love your name. So I want to ask you, can you share your name with us and what your name means?
Yeah. So my parents, the way they told it to me is that, my dad was gonna provide the last name Figueroa, and so my mom would provide the first name, which was a Jewish name, Ariel. And
Mm.
so not too long ago, somebody actually was telling me they found the etymology of the name Figueroa, and it comes from a region outside Barcelona. And the story is that it was developed by convertidos, which is Jews that converted to Catholicism during the Inquisition. And Higo means fig, and Rio means river, and Higo Rio turned into Figueroa, which means fig tree by the river, and this is kind of like what they used to identify that group. So it's kind of like, and this is a story that happened, for many Jewish communities in Spain and in Europe at that time, and the other side, my name Ariel is it means in Hebrew Lion of God, which
Mm.
is a really like heavy, intense, intense
Lion of
name, which was,
God. I love it.
yeah, I mean, which was like, pretty, uh, pretty big name for a shy kid, um, but Ariel, it also is very kind of soft and angelic, and it's in the Christian tradition, it's like one of the angels. Um, but it's kind of funny because my mom, picked this name, but I don't think she realized at the time that Ariel is like a very common Puerto Rican, a very common Puerto Rican name as well, and because it's in the Christian
So
Bible and
what a beautiful
in the
like
Old Testament.
blending. It was
Yeah.
a perfect intersection for your parents. So yeah, can you share your a bit about your inheritance with everyone that is watching, where you're what you would say if someone said Ariel, which I'm sure you get this question a lot, where are you from? What would you say? I know that's a
Hmm.
complex question and answer, but you can go on and share kind of the full, what would your full answer be to that question?
For sure. Well, it's funny. I was on a road trip with my sister not too long ago, and she was talking about bioregionalism, and she was saying how now some people are like are saying they're talking about the geography, the natural geography where they're from. So I think it's interesting to kind of think about it in that way. Just for like the first introduction, it's like I'm on a very tiny island, and I grew up next to a river. And that island happens to be Manhattan, and that the river happens to be the Hudson River. But in a way, it very much did shape my life. You know, I grew up next to the Hudson River, like since I was a kid, all through my teenage years, and even now I go down there and meditate. So um, that's where I was. That's where I was born and raised, um, and have spent most of my life with some brief time living in Argentina and Spain as well. My family comes from, again, of Puerto Rican and Jewish descent. So my dad's family is on the Puerto Rican side, and comes from a small town in Puerto Rico in the mountains called San Lorenzo. And my grandfather on that side was from an aristocratic family, and my mother was from a peasant family,
Huh.
and you know looked very different. Uh, my grandfather looked very Spaniard, very had very European features, and my grandmother, I mean, pretty much looks like an indigenous Native American woman. Um,
Was there
although I
was
couldn't.
their courtship controversial in their time?
Yeah, it was basically frowned upon. For him to marry somebody of that class and status was not looked well upon by his family. But knowing my grandmother, she's kind of like she's definitely the matriarch of the family. She's like kind of has like the Care Bear energy, like her heart kind of like radiates out and changes everything in its radius. And she was a very beautiful and powerful, spiritually powerful woman. Um, so obviously it was a love that could not be stopped, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I feel like
um,
everyone I talk to who is mixed in any way, there's an inherited story of bravery, of
mhm.
people being brave enough to love across whatever boundary you want to draw, right? Boundary of country, class, color. There's always two people who are brave enough to love each other and have a union and leave a legacy that is more complex and beautiful than they expected probably. So that's
Yeah.
really it's interesting. I just was reflecting and thinking about that now listening to this story that you're telling me. Um, so please go on.
Well, I think it's a great point, and I think I think this it's interesting because in Puerto Rico, you have a community that is is all shades, from European white will get a sunburn, although that's not too many, all the way down to completely dark skin, African features, and um, so you have a community that is completely diverse in that way, but is still united. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's you know that's one of the things that really defines Puerto Rican people in my experience is the sense of community. And my uncle told me a story about when my grandfather died. He died when my dad was very young, and when that happened, they were living in New York, and there were several families that were very close. And when her husband died, my grandfather died, they pulled all the cousins out of private school, and they said, "We're going to do this together. We're going to help support this family. This is how it
Wow.
works." And there was just it was just an understanding. Nobody questioned that. Of course, the cousins questioned that because they were in like these crazy public schools in the Bronx for the first time, and that's another story. But I
Yeah,
think
pivotal moment in their development for sure.
yeah, and so I feel like in some ways I've inherited that mentality that, when it comes to family, it's just an understanding that you will take care of one another. When my goddaughter, when my cousin asked me to be the godfather of her child, it was just understood that from that point on, like, I was to be her spiritual guardian. And sure enough, it's come with a lot of trials and tribulations, but it's like, that's how it works. And that connection, I think, has a tremendously powerful healing property. That relationship that I'm developing with her is healing all various generations of my family. People kind of are getting involved, and working through a lot of stuff. So that's a little bit about my background on that side. And then my mother's family is from Eastern European descent. Um, I'm not too familiar exactly with the particular regions, but um, in Russia and Poland were the regions where they immigrated from, and they were part of this what's called first wave Jewish immigration. So this is a wave of immigration that came prior to World War II, when Jews were being pushed out of Europe by the Nazis.
Yeah.
And this was, which I'm sure you probably know a little bit about as well.
Do you know what years or the time frame?
I want to say I would have to do some more research, but I think it was around the 20s, 30s. And I think they went from that area through England and then to New York.
It's likely that they also lived in the Pale of Settlement, which is why a lot of people are like, I'm not sure exactly where in Russia or Poland my Jewish European ancestors are from, because for a long period of time they lived in their own segment of land called the Pale of Settlement, that were all the Jewish shtetls. And you needed to have like papers to travel between each shtetl, like between each village as well. So a lot of us can trace our roots, especially if we have Ashkenazi genes, back to this region of land that was between Belarus and Poland and Latvia. It was like kind of like right in the middle of all of those.
So some of your history is traced to there as well?
Yes. My mom's whole...
So basically we're distant cousins.
Probably. I'm sure that our ancestors, passed each other in the village or something, or broke bread, which is like really incredible. If you really think about, we can meet across an entire ocean and find all of these connections that could have been possible between all of our ancestors, because globalization has been happening for a lot longer than people really think. So I'm sure there are some incredible stories. I wish there was a way to know for sure. But
yeah. So yeah, so they went to England, they came to New York. I think my mother grew up like for the first couple of years in Washington DC, and then came to New York. And my grandmother, I didn't get to meet. She actually passed away the day before my parents got married. It was kind of an interesting thing. The Jewish tradition says nothing stops a wedding. So grandma passed away. Yeah, exactly. So like it was like the wedding, which actually took place in my grandfather's house. Wow. And then the very next day everybody came back for the funeral. It's interesting little tidbit of family history. But I kind of like that tradition though.
Yeah.
For me, I just love weddings. I feel like the celebration of love is like the highest level of celebration,
Well, definitely, and Jewish weddings especially are like the most lively weddings I have attended in my time on this earth. So I'm sure that was a very potent and emotional time for your family. Wow, cool. Thank you for some of this context. And so then your parents met in New York. Do you know the story?
Well, I think they met at a party. Actually, they didn't meet at that party, but they were at a mutual friends party, and my dad's friend said, Tony, did you see anybody that you were interested at this party? And he thought about it. He was like, well, there was this one girl, Andrea. So I think they like arranged a double date. And my dad, I think they all went like salsa dancing. And like, that was my dad staying from a very young age. Like he was like a really, a really good salsa dancer and like was going to all these clubs.
Okay,
So
so dancing is like in your inheritance because I was sharing that. I don't know if it was the first time I tried to go live or the second time, but that you and I met on a dance floor. So that's part of our
yeah,
inheritance story. Um, but
yeah.
that's amazing. So your dad was like, I will go, you know, dance this woman off her feet.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're a good salsa dancer, it's like pretty much the best way to like impress somebody. um, and yeah, and so I think that was the beginning, and it went from there. Interestingly enough, it was another marriage that was kind of uh, intermixing from different classes. My mother's family was they weren't wealthy, but they had a nice home in Riverside Drive. My grandfather was a writer, and my grandmother worked in social services. Um, they were both employed, and my grandmother, which was not common for her time, was like very highly educated and had a position of status in her workplace. And so my dad was this Puerto Rican kid from the Bronx, but at that point he kind of had his own trajectory in terms of like leaving the Bronx to go to Ivy League schools and become an architect and had an architecture firm. So I feel like and he's also very, very, one of the smartest people I know. So I think they met him and were probably like, oh, this is how this is going to
Yeah.
go.
How was that like growing up? Were there, you often have shared with me that you feel lucky that you were fully belonging to both sides, both cultures that you were raised in, both the Jewish culture and the Puerto Rican culture. But what did that tangibly look like at home, like the marriage of Puerto Rican and Jewish culture? Did each of your parents adopt each other's cultural practices, rituals,
Yeah,
beliefs?
that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so I think it would start with with the conversation they had, and they basically were wanted to be deliberate and say like how will we raise our children? Do we want to raise them Jewish? Do we want to raise them Christian? And they were I think at the brink of like finding like a medium, which was should we raise them in the school of ethical culture, like in the middle? But my dad said no, because there's no God there, and that was like his kind of
Wow.
one of the things that stood out for him. So
Yeah.
my mother, I think, ultimately, expressed that it was important for us to be Jewish. But years later, my mom tells me, uh, my mom tells me that my dad said, if you want your children to be Jewish, that means you have to be Jewish, because she was not really a practicing Jew at that point. So she actually, and I didn't know this till maybe a couple of years ago, she actually went back to synagogue, started like learning the rituals and the songs
Okay.
and the ceremonies, and she did that so that she could share that with me and my sister, and we did end up being raised Jewish, but we were also baptized, and we celebrated both Christmas and Hanukkah, and kind of celebrated both. I didn't really go to church as much. We definitely went to synagogue on a more regular basis when I was growing up, um, and so in the home that translated into um, the Shabbat, having the Jewish Sabbath, which we call Shabbat, and that was a ritual. Every Friday, we would sit down together as a family, have dinner. We'd sing the blessings, um, and when I took the first workshop of yours is when I actually realized, you asked the question like, what is your defining moment, from one of the five C's, and I realized that was very much a defining practice in my life. It was kind of this something that just was in my DNA, like that. Every Friday we gather together as a family. There's a singing. There's there's a singing component, you know, which is very powerful, even if you don't understand it at the time. Having, you know, spiritually connecting through vibration, and connecting to like an ancient, you know, an ancient lineage essentially. Um,
Yeah.
and I also think just on a more a practical level, it binds a family together. So that was kind of how it looked like. So we do Shabbat on Fridays, and then, you know, we'd go to, like, you know, Christmas party and be dancing salsa. It was very much, um, you know, to your
Sounds
point earlier,
fluid.
like it was a foot in both worlds. And I think, yeah, I think that's perhaps unique because a lot of people, you know, who grow up in multi-ethnic families have a completely different experience where they don't feel like they belong in either. And I feel really blessed that, you know, I had an experience growing up where I was like fully, you know, I fully felt Puerto Rican and I fully felt Jewish, and it just, you know, that was just the way it was, you know.
Think that that the way you were treated by both of these communities factors into that, just in the sense of, you know, a lot of the time people feel othered, not necessarily even because they don't feel like they belong, but people in those communities are like, you're not really Jewish, or you're not really Puerto Rican. Like, did you face any of
Mm.
that when you were growing up, or no, you just were fully embraced and accepted by both communities? Or did you ever feel in any way conflicted or confused, or like, you know, unsure, am I Christian, am I Jewish? Like, what was that experience like for you, or how did that lead to your own understanding of spirituality? Because I think it's very unique for a family to fully embrace both. I think, you know, my family
Hmm.
celebrated everything, but not from a spiritual point of view. It was much more like we are stripped of our of God by being raised in a communist nation,
Right,
and
right,
are
right.
rediscovering what spirituality means, and we're just celebrating these holidays because technically my dad is Russian Orthodox and technically my mother is Jewish, you know, but like there
Hmm.
was not this whole, I knew we were celebrating the holiday just to celebrate the holiday. I wasn't like, oh, am I Jewish? Am I Christian? I personally felt more Jewish than anything else, but only because that was an inherited experience of persecution and escaping Russia as a refugee in the first place. You know, so that
Hmm.
was why that narrative was so much stronger for me. I can't say if I was like, if my dad had been persecuted and we came as Christian refugees, like who knows? Maybe I would have felt,
Mm.
you know, more more Christian. Like this is something I really ask myself a lot. So I'm curious what that was
Yeah,
like for you.
that's a great question. I think it's there's two parts to that. I think the spirituality is connected, but also another conversation that I would love to touch upon. But in terms of like how I was treated and how I was, you know, um, how I connected with those communities. So when I think an interesting thought that comes up, as we're moving towards this conversation about, whiteness in multi-ethnic communities, I think the fact that I look racially ambiguous was a big played a big part in that. You know, some people, you know, there's this aspect of having a skin color experience. There's an aspect also of having, phenotypical features that really that kind of place you in one category or the other. I think because of the way I appear, I was accepted in Jewish communities as Jewish, and I was accepted in, Hispanic communities as Hispanic. So when I was growing up in the Upper West Side, at that time, it looked a lot different than it does now. At that time, it was, a very large Puerto Rican population. There was and still is a Jewish population there. So I was, you know, in my public school, I was with maybe 50% of the school was maybe 25% was black, maybe more, and maybe another, you know, I don't know how many percents are left, but another percentage was like was Jewish, and I think, I mean, I would say, you know, the Lucy from Connecticut's and the Chad, and the executive Chads were probably in the minority. So I feel like being connected to the Latino community, um, was very natural, and we also it was also a bilingual program, so I was speaking Spanish every other day with them. I think that also had a, you know, big
Wow,
impact.
I didn't know that. So you were speaking
Yeah,
Spanish every other day in school.
yeah, it was one day English, one day Spanish, and everybody in the class would you know would go through that, and all the subjects were taught in that way, and that was up until yeah, up until fifth
Oh no,
grade.
you're breaking up for me a little
Um,
bit.
Say again.
Sorry, can you repeat what you just said?
Oh, that we would it was English. It was a bilingual program, so one day English, one day Spanish, up until fifth grade.
Okay, up
And
until fifth
then
grade. I think that's really unique. I don't know very many. This was a private school or a public school?
this is a public school. Yeah.
Cool.
At that time in New York, like at that time in New York, there was a lot of really progressive schools. And this was, I think, I mean, on the one hand, it's like a progressive idea. On the other hand, it's like most of our, let's make this, let's make this equitable, make it work.
Right.
And at the end of the day, like from being, an educator and having studied some of that research, you actually know that learning two languages at the same time is actually really good for the development of your brain. Um,
Yeah,
but so
definitely.
yeah, on the other side of that, I also my parents also put me in Hebrew school, um, which I think you were in as well.
No, I was
And so
not. This is what
I
I
had
mean about my whole
oh,
complex.
you're not.
No, I never went to Hebrew school, but I still had a bat mitzvah. Meanwhile, my partner went to
Okay, okay.
Hebrew school, didn't have a bat mitzvah because he was not sure he was fully committing, and I just didn't even see it that way. So, again, our perspectives on our cultural background are like so nuanced depending on the context in which we grew
Yeah.
up, which is a lot of what we talk about. And I'm glad that you were sharing that your experience of whiteness within multi-ethnic background has allowed you to belong in more than one space. I think is a really interesting perspective to hear. And for those watching, Ariel is going to co-facilitate our upcoming workshop with Priscilla, which is all about unpacking whiteness in multi-ethnic background, context, understanding how all the nuances work together. Um, so I'm curious for you, Ariel, like when did you know what is the path between the Ariel that graduated from high school to the Ariel that we see in front of us today? I know that's a big question, but what else has
Mm.
contributed to your
Yeah,
identity
that's it's a lot of
as
path, a
Ariel
lot of path
today
there.
versus the Ariel Figueroa? Yeah, on
So
this journey.
after high school, it's funny, I when I was so the next step after high school was college. I think at that time I was kind of like a little, a little hoodlum and getting into lots of trouble. But I realized, I wanted to my motivation for going to college was like I want to go to Spain to study abroad. There was some magical, mythical something about that I knew like to get there you're going to go to college, and going to college is for you anyway.
This seems
Is going to
related
be a
to your
benefit. But
inheritance. So did you idolize Spain in some way? You were like, I'm Hispanic and I want to go to Spain because of that.
it was like a bunch of different factors. So like I had a friend who went to Spain and came back with these amazing tales. And then my dad after he finished college went to Madrid and worked as an architect there. So it kind of had this mythological place. And then I shared with you not too long ago one of my like quintessential childhood books was Ferdinand the Bull, about the pacifist bull who doesn't want to be in bullfights, and his gorgeous illustrations of Spain. So I think there was like this like nebulous mythology of like Spain being, really connected, and of course, being, part of the lineage through Puerto Rico. So
Yeah.
um, so I went to, but there was an interesting thought that when I was looking at colleges, I went to several colleges, and I remember this moment where I was I went to UConn, University of Connecticut, and I could just see that it was a completely white environment, like. but not the kind that not the kind that I knew. And it was like this moment of realization that like, wow, I'm going to be other here. Like this is not as comfortable for me as an environment where I'm in a multicultural. And it was like the first time I really, it was the first time I really had that experience. Like, oh wow, this is not my community. Um,
Right.
which is interesting because in many ways, like growing up, I was perhaps on the lighter skin end of the spectrum. Um, but I'm going to University at Albany, um, and in my junior year, I took my first yoga class, and I kind of look at that in a way as like kind of my entry point into like the world of healing and spirituality. At the time, I was going there because my friend invited me, and she was like, there's gonna be a lot of cute girls there," and I was like, "Sign me up." So, so I went to this yoga class, and at the end, you know, when we came into shavasana, I just like melted into the floor and had this like total visual experience, which seemed like it lasted a week, and then I came to and I was like, "Oh my gosh, like what is happening here?" Um, and that kind of opened up this world of yoga. And you know, I started studying yoga for the next, well, since then, um, and that led into an interest in doing healing work. Massage therapy and Thai massage in particular became an avenue through which I really wanted to work with people. After having done yoga teacher training and starting to teach a little bit, that kind of evolved into just the idea. I mean, I often look at it as um, what I actually a friend actually told me. He's like, Ariel, I understand what you do. You create sacred space for people, and I realized that that's kind of has been this theme, perhaps since high school when I really started creating things in the world. It's really been creating spaces for people to drop in and really connect with themselves, be it to see themselves, be it to transform, be it to connect with something underneath their you know waking experience. That's kind of the theme of what happened in that yoga class, right? And that's what happened
Right.
in yoga classes I was teaching. That's what
What
happened
were
in
you
massage
studying?
sessions, people kind of
What,
going inside.
just so we can follow the journey. So in high school, because I know a bit of your story. In high school, you were a musician. You studied music at LaGuardia. Yeah, right?
Studied art.
Art.
I
Okay.
studied visual art. Yeah.
Oh, the whole time. And then you went to college for visual art too?
No,
Or no?
actually, a little piece I skipped over. So
Yeah, take me back a
the
little
first two
bit
years
before we
that
go into you
the first two
holding
years I
sacred
was at
space.
well the first 2 years I was in LaGuardia for and at this time there was not much sacred space. So space like gallivanting in the streets was running amok, you know, going to parties and having a lot of issues with my parents.
Okay,
And
so this is the
after
hoodlum
sophomore year, they
Ariel
were
that
like,
you are
yeah,
referring to. Okay.
yes. And Hoodlum Arrow was kind of you're out of control. We're gonna take you and put you in this boarding school because we don't want you to we don't want your life to go down the drain. So for my second 2 years of high school, I was in a school in upstate New York called Storm King, and you know, surprise, you know, boarding school was like even more devious than you know
Of
kids
course.
in the city. Like they were
Storm
just getting
King has a
into so much more
school. I
trouble,
just
you
know
know.
it as like incredible sculpture garden.
Separate entity, same area. Storm King School is like kind of
I,
in the same area, but it's like this small little boarding school. That's really funny. It's like it was like 200 kids. It was half Korean, and it was like a lot of you know like many kids from the city would go there. It was kind of a school that like if you were smart, like they would send you there like to kind of like try to route you back to college. So that was kind of the trajectory that we went through. So got into a lot of trouble there as well, but um, did not get kicked out and, and got myself into college, thankfully, which which led to the rest of the journey we find ourselves on now.
Got it. And what did you
Um,
study in college before
but
you took the life-changing yoga class?
it's sociology. So kind of, I mean, most of my most memorable courses were actually very much related to what we're talking about now. And I was lucky to have some really amazing professors, and dove into, race and ethnicity in a really robust way, and studied, social movements and how social movements are born and grow. Um, so it was really, super fascinating, course of study.
Mm-hmm.
And, it, it led me to, I mean, it's a strong basis for like the work that we're doing now. I think it also was, contributed to my interest in working with children and kind of the social justice aspects of education that I later went into. Um, so I guess we're kind of skipping around here, but, um, I guess to kind of come back to the last part of the story, like at the time when I was opening up to these healing arts, yoga and yoga and dance and massage work. Um, my uncle, reached out to me and said, um, Ariel, I'm gonna be going to the jungle, and we're gonna be doing, some ceremonies with the shaman there to cleanse and clean out. And he was referring to ayahuasca, which was before this was like a household name, right?
Yeah.
And so, you
Before
know,
all the hippie
I
kids
me
were
and him
doing
had
ayahuasca
me
in
and him
their
had a,
parents' bedrooms.
or shall we say, all the CEOs in their on their corporate retreats. Um,
Yeah.
and so and so me and him had at the end of college, I had lived in Argentina with him for about 6 months. We were super close, um, and I knew for various reasons that was part of the journey, part of my life journey, that I should be on that journey, and that was a very pivotal and transformational, period. And I was there for about a month, um, working with some different shaman and moving around, an area of the Peruvian Amazon called, Pucallpa, and and in that exploration, I realized that I wanted to work with children, that I wanted to, in some capacity. At first, it kind of came as like, am I supposed to be a movement therapist? Am I supposed to be, a doctor?
Right.
But eventually, it came to the realization that teaching was like part of that path, and I went on after that experience to apply to Hunter College and did a master's in childhood education. And that was kind of the next like
It's very
major,
cool to see all these pieces coming together. It, you know,
yeah.
it's making more sense why you ended up, like your friend said, creating sacred spaces. It's, sociology piece, coming from a multicultural background, understanding identity and movements, the
Hmm.
yoga practice that changed your life. It's interesting because I'm looking at all these experiences and thinking of how they are all mirrors for moments in my life where all these
Hmm.
different pieces showed me a little bit about what I was meant to be doing. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, it makes sense that we ended up working in this company together. And it's
Well,
always
I think
exciting to
like
see
myself, I
how.
think you have like are drawing from like a humongous like network of experiences, similarly, and and I feel like this project that we're creating is it has a very like essential core to it, but it does really reach into so many different aspects of the construction of a person and how they see themselves and what they go on to do with their lives. Um,
Definitely.
yeah.
And here we are doing the work ourselves. That's an important part of this whole process is us unpacking our own inheritances and understanding why we are drawn to the work that we're doing. So I want to hear more about what are the beliefs that you feel you inherited in your upbringing that you either like radically shifted for you as an adult, or that you became aware was like a cultural narrative that that you feel you've gotten a new viewpoint on
Hmm.
as an adult?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, like I think that in many ways, I've held my dad on this pedestal for a long time, and in some ways still do. So I think a lot of like the nuggets that he had, like these little like distilled nuggets that he would always like drive home, and I think those really burn themselves into my consciousness. And for example, he would always say anything worth doing is worth doing right.
Mm.
And I think this is kind of like a piece that has stayed with me. And perhaps at this point I think I'm you know a perfectionist in recovery, but
This
I think also
scarred you. You were like, oh my God, everything has to be right.
but also on the other side of that coin, it's like if you're gonna invest your time and energy into something, like go all the way,
Mm.
like give
Yeah.
it your all. So I think I mean that I try to bring to everything that I do.
So that has
um
stuck with you. That's something that you have assimilated into like a core Ariel belief is like things are worth doing. Right maybe isn't the right word, but worth putting your all into.
yeah, like if you're gonna create something, like create it all the way, like like fully form it, like give it everything you have. I think on the other side, and I think that's also a piece of that is like really wanting, since I am holding space for people, to like be incredibly intentional about how you're doing that, whether it's a yoga class, whether it's a preschool class. Like this is important, like what the space in which you invite people is can be really powerful and transformative. So like give it everything you have. um but I think, and I think there's probably more to unpack around like cultural beliefs, but I think one of the major ones I think that I'm still unpacking now and working with is, which I think I probably shared in some of our conversations, is about love and what our world and what our culture teaches us about love. And you know, I, like most people, we grow up with a narrative that you get to a certain age, you date around a little bit, you find the one, you fall in love, and you live happily ever after. And then you know you start to realize that over the course of one's life, that this narrative is a lot more complicated than it was led to believe. Like in the 2 hour movie, it ends and they go into the sunset, and you believe that's how it ends.
Right.
Um, but it just doesn't even begin to capture the complexities of what it means to actually love another person, what it means to actually accept love from other people, um, and what it means to go through the course of your life and loving people in different ways. Um, I think this theme for me right now has become, with from what distance must I love this person, you know and the narrative would have it, the narrative would have it one way, that like you come together, you become one, and then you live out your days like that. While my experience has been, finding somebody you believe is your soulmate, and then realizing, for a whole litany of reasons, like you can't have the ending to that story, and realizing, oh wow, like after for example, in one of my relationships, after 7 years, realizing that we had to pull away to grow in certain ways,
Mm.
and that I would have to relearn how to love that person from this distance. You know, um, so these are the kind of things that come up in one's life that you really don't that you're really not privy to. And so I think that's part of unpacking this, decolonizing love and unpacking what it means to be in relationship, has been um, one of the biggest challenges and growing opportunities in my life, that I'm still very much in. Like I'm 35, and the narrative has always been also with like, for example, like with having children, like you'll meet that person, you'll have children. Interestingly now, like a lot of the women who are my age or who I come into contact with have children already. And so it's like all these, this the narrative needs to be like opened up a lot wider. Um, and that's been a big one, that's a big one because love, that love and the feelings associated with it, like go like right to the deepest parts of us. Um, so I think, you know, in many ways our society is like opening up that narrative to encompass more ideas about, what that experience can encompass. And I think that's really powerful to share with people, in this work we're doing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing vulnerably about that. I think that a lot of people have inherited unconscious narratives about love from their parents, from their experiences in the world, from the media. And, it really is a journey to realize that you can define your belief about love for yourself and to figure out what you do believe. It can be, a lifelong journey for some people. Um,
Hmm.
but I think it's really beautiful when you're aware of it and you're
Hmm.
able to experiment or widen the possibilities of what you can believe, where it's not just it's one way or it's nothing, which I think a lot of people think. I either get married and have that picket fence or whatever the cultural or societal pressures around relationship are on me, or else, there's like no other option essentially.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting in how we apply that to a lot of other beliefs. So another question I really was curious to ask you is what do people usually like? What do you usually brush up against? Where does this conversation around identity and inheritance actually pop up in your life? Like, is there something that people usually assume about you when they meet you that you feel you have to correct them around, or like do conversations around where you're from? How do those arise in your life usually? Is a question I have.
Hmm. It's a good question. I mean, I think that, I think historically for me, because I grew up in New York City on the Upper West Side in such a multicultural environment, the the nature of my identity has always been a point of like interest and fascination for people, and I think I've embraced it in that way. Because I often tell people I'm Jurican, and they're like, oh, and they have that reaction. So like, it kind of becomes a point of interest for people that I like to share. It's like, yeah, like, you know, like uh, like there's a lot of us out here, and
Do you know other Euricans?
I know a couple. There's some like there's some like celebrities. There's some like celebrity children that I know are Jewish. Like I know John Leguizamo married a Jewish woman. I know I know.
You need to make your own like Facebook group and see if you have like similar cultural understandings.
Yeah, yeah. Juricans unite.
Yeah.
Juriqua. Um, I mean, well, I will share about an interesting situation that came up. With as of recently, when since the death of George Floyd, these conversations have shifted, and a lot of new stuff is coming up. And I think it's such a powerful time right now because we're in an environment now where so many different perspectives are now coming into the table, and like we're having conversations where there's not right and wrong. There's really like you said before, Katya, like coming into like really unpacking the nuances of all these things. And so I had an interesting experience where a good friend of mine, a good friend of mine invited me to a healing circle for men of color, and this is somebody who's actually in the men's group that I help facilitate, and he invited me to this healing circle. And in that moment, I had this really interesting debate with myself, and I said, and I was like, do I belong there? You know, is it wrong for me to be there? Um, and ultimately, I decided not to go to that meeting. And my roommate, I talked to my roommate about it. Um, and he was exceptionally sharp, and he was saying, well, you know, like if you go to another state in Trump country, like you are not white, like you will be discriminated against. Um, and you know, and but at that moment, I felt, you know, like that I don't think that I've had the same experience as the people in that circle. That although I do have some relationship to my place in what we could refer to as this racial hierarchy that our culture creates. That I know that because of my skin color, I haven't had the same experience. I haven't faced
Right.
the same discrimination as perhaps people in that circle, and so I didn't know if that was. I felt that, you know,
Yeah.
it wasn't the right space.
Well, I
In
think.
retrospect, sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
no, finish. In retrospect.
Uh, in retrospect, I think that if were I to do that again, I think I would have gone um, because I think that it's value, like there is value in sharing the multitude of experiences. And I think, you know, and my roommate also said, you know, like it's the one drop rule. It's the one drop rule. Like you technically are a person of
In
color
America or in the
in
United
America,
States, certainly.
right?
But I think what you're speaking to is, if the container of this group was for people to commiserate about a skin color experience and racism, and you may face xenophobia if you go to, another state, but it's kind of hard to tell whether or not you would actually face discrimination based on your skin color unless you go and experience that for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I mean, I think that would be a very interesting experiment. BuzzFeed used to have those like follow cam like things of like following a woman on the street while she's being catcalled, or following someone in different environments and just seeing, like, capturing how people respond to them in that environment. I think is um, a really interesting experiment, because if you did go to a different state and you were discriminated against based on the color of your skin, then absolutely that you would find solace and solidarity with people who can share that experience with you. But I think this it ends up being the question that you probably have to ask yourself a lot, and we have to ask ourselves a lot, of like, what is the intention of the container? And like,
Mm-hmm.
me being in the skin color or body I'm in, am I, by joining, am I adding or in any way like taking away from the sanctity of that container or the intention
Yeah.
of that container? Which I think is a really valuable inquiry all the time, no matter what spaces we're invited into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and this is kind of like very much going into the conversation that we'll be having with Priscilla, which is this very kind of well, at this point, controversial idea um, that looks at white privilege and whiteness in multi-ethnic identities, and really recognizing that you know that people taking the Hispanic example for instance, somebody like myself will have a completely different experience, and I will experience white privilege in many ways, and have throughout my whole lifetime. You know, that I can check off the box for Hispanic on my college application. When I show up in the interview, I present very differently,
Right.
and the people that are, you know, are receiving me and how I present, whether consciously or unconsciously, goes into their selection process, um, and plays into their
Yeah.
biases and their preferences into the kind of environment that they want to create in their school. You know, so I think it is a really powerful conversation, that I'm looking forward to digging into a little bit more. Um,
I'm so
and that,
excited for you to
yeah,
facilitate. So that'll be August 16th. Those of you who are watching, it'll be a co-facilitated experience, mixed modalities, really exciting dialogue and discussion. So if you're interested and you're feeling that this is resonating with you, stay tuned. We are about to release all of the information about that. And we have a little bit of time left, Ariel, so I'm just going to ask you one final question,
Mm.
which is, what do you want to leave in your legacy? It's my favorite question. I ask everyone at the end, if you look at your inheritance and you say, this part of what makes me me is really important for me to pass on to whether or not you have children, pass on to your community, to those that you are going to influence in your lifetime, what would it be?
Mm. I think, I mean, the first thing that came to mind is community. Like, I think, in my life, that's always been like the gathering element has always been like the glue that brings my life together. Whether it was my family when I was like sitting around the dinner table, which is where I learned to talk and to talk about ideas. It's where I learned to sing. It's where I learned to connect with people on an intellectual level. Um, and then later that turned into bringing friends communities together, later bringing spiritual communities together, and now bringing um, communities together around doing work on themselves. So I think, when I look at the future of my life, I say like a successful life will be one in which I can bring a community together to really feel a sense of belonging, and I hope to do that in my community of friends. I hope to do that in my community of work, which is now becoming the same community, which I'm so grateful for. Um, and I think that the legacy I would like to leave is whether it's a physical space or whether it is a community of people who gather. Um, some sort of structure, and I guess this comes back to this word that I said, this phrase that I mentioned to you, spiritual architecture, like leaving the structure for people to come into and to come into togetherness in a very intentional way. I think that's the thing that I could most hope for to leave to the next generations, whether be they
Beautiful.
mine or be they the people that we help, having the structures for people to come together and feel in togetherness. I think that's honestly the antidote to like 95% of the world's problems right
The
now.
world's ills can be solved through
Yeah.
community and belonging. I mean, I agree. I think that loneliness is the real virus of the human race. So that's what we're trying to do, is bring people together and see their similarities over their differences and honor their differences too. And okay, so we have a little time left. What's something that does not go into your spiritual architecture that has been a part of your spiritual architecture that you are actively working on and releasing?
Oh, good question. Um, um, that I'm actively releasing that I don't want to bring me into that world. Um,
You have 2 minutes. This is our final answer.
um, let me think. Well, I mean, I feel like I feel like my journey right now is really about self love. Um, I'll share my wedding ring to self. Um, after a string of relationships that after my recent string of relationships, I realized that there was a missing piece that was Ariel really loving himself. And that I think is a lifelong journey, but I think there is like a threshold um, where you can really start to take that cycle of uh, take that cycle of love and like bring it into yourself, where you don't have to rely on other people to complete that cycle. And I had a really interesting conversation with my very close friend, Kristen, who's my neighbor, um, and who's a brilliant social worker and healer. And we were talking about like attachment theory and how like a lot of this stuff is like set up like in the first months of life. How your caretakers are tuned to you,
Yeah.
and how if they're like, if it's done correctly, you're able to create healthy attachments. And I think that you know, a lot of us in the course of our relationships with our caregivers and with the people that love us and that we love, we create these cycles that cycle through another person.
Yeah.
That you need to give love and need to receive love from others, and when that cycle is disrupted, your whole equilibrium gets thrown off.
We're about to be cut off. We'll come back on.